Welcome to AskFOI, where we answer the most common questions we receive about prophecy, Israel, and the Bible. With me today is Bruce Scott. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be with you.
Bruce, Esther is a familiar story in the Bible, especially for those that grew up in a Christian home and we went to Sunday school. We heard this story a lot, but I don't know that I remember hearing a lot about the history of Esther and what's behind this and the holiday Purim. So, if you would you give us the history of the holiday Purim?
Sure. Purim is actually the happiest holiday on the Jewish calendar, and there's a reason for that. It does, like many Jewish holidays, has a historical background, and you can find that in the book of Esther, obviously. But it goes back to four main characters back in the 5th century BC. The king of Persia, whose name was Ahasuerus, or historians usually know him as Xerxes. Then there is the lady of the story. Her name is Esther. That's her Persian name, but her Hebrew name was Hadassah. And she was an orphan. She was raised by her cousin Mordecai, who is another player, big player in the story. Mordecai actually had a job near the palace, and so he plays a big part in this as well. And then there's also the bad guy of the story, whose name is Haman or Haman, and he is the poster child of anti-Semitism and has been throughout history. So the way the story went is that the king wanted to display his queen Vashti before a number of guests. She refused, so she lost her crown, and as a result of that, there was a Miss Persia beauty pageant, if you will, and Esther was part of that selection, if you will, to see if who would replace Vashti as the queen. Mordecai told Esther, "Don't tell anybody your Jewish background." Remember, the Jewish people were captives at the time in Persia, and in God's providence, she was chosen as the next queen. Well, it so happened that Haman was one of the king's advisors, one of the top men, and he liked to get a lot of accolades. And so when he would go out and the populace, people would bow down before him. But Mordecai, being Jewish, refused to bow down to him. And the scriptures really don't say why. It could be because Mordecai maybe just didn't bow down before anybody else except God, or because he knew that Haman was was an Amalekite, meaning he was a descendant from Amalek. And the Amalekites were God's enemies and the enemies of Israel. In fact, he had told Israel back in the days of Moses and Joshua that they were to wipe out the Amalekites because of how they had treated Israel on their Exodus journey. So apparently, Haman was a descendant of them. So Haman hated the fact that Mordecai didn't bow down to him, so he made a plan to execute Mordecai and to hang him from a 75-foot gallows. Well, he wasn't just satisfied with that. Haman, when he realized that Mordecai was a Jew, he planned to wipe out all the Jews. And so he tried to figure out when would be the best day to do that. And the way that he tried to figure that out was to cast lots. And the word for lots in the plural is Purim. And that's where the holiday's name came from. So he settled on the 13th day of the month Adar. That's the 12th month in the Jewish calendar. That's when all of the Jewish people were to be destroyed. And in fact, he persuaded King Xerxes to sign a command, a ruling, if you will, that all of the Jewish people on that day were to be destroyed. And once that command was given, the law of the Medes and the Persians, you could not rescind it. So when this word got around, people were, very upset, especially the Jewish people. Mordecai told his cousin Esther, "You need to go in to the king and appeal to him and to have him stop this." Well, you couldn't just appear before the king. you had to be given permission. So you could try to appear before the king, and if he extended his golden scepter to you, then that meant he was giving you permission to come forward. So Esther said, I could die if he doesn't extend that golden scepter, then I would be killed on the spot. But she said, if I perish, I perish. So she was willing to give up her life for the sake of her people. So she appeared before the king, and in God's providence, he extended his golden scepter. The king extended his golden scepter to Esther. And she invited him, along with Haman, to appear uh, for a special banquet that she was having. So Haman was all excited about that and went home, told his family, and he then made the plans to have Mordecai executed. And so the next day, as he was coming to tell the king that he wanted permission to execute Mordecai, the previous night the king had a bad night's sleep, and so he had the records brought before him, and he was told the stories. They read to him all of the records that had happened during his kingship. One of those that he was not aware of was that Mordecai apparently had heard of an assassination plot and had warned about this and had, in effect, saved the king's life. So the king said, has anything been done for Mordecai? And they said no. So right about that time, here comes Haman in to ask for the king's permission to execute Mordecai. And little did Haman know that the king had been looking at these records. And so as soon as Haman comes in, the king says, what should be done to the man that the king desires to honor? So Haman, in his pride and arrogance, thought that the king was talking about him. So he said, well, let him be given the king's robe and put on the king's horse and, brought forth, around the city to the people, and have someone go before calling, this is what the king does for the man that the king desires to honor. And the king says, well, good idea. Do that for Mordecai. And so Haman was quite crestfallen, and he obeyed the king and was very embarrassed. And he did honor Mordecai in front of everyone. So he then ran home with his tail between his legs, if you will, and told his family. And they said, well, if he's Jewish, there's no way you're going to win against this guy. And right about that time, they called him to go to the banquet. They take him to the banquet. And there at the banquet, Esther tells the king that she says, please, can't you do something for my people that are about to be executed? And the king said, well, who would do such a thing? And she points her finger at Haman and says, Haman, this is the evildoer. And so the king knew that he had been tricked and he was in a bind. And so he went out of the room, and while he was out of the room, Haman begs for his life in front of Esther, and he falls on the couch where she is, and it appears from anybody watching that he may be assaulting her. The king comes back at that time, recognizes what's happening, and they grab Haman and they hang him on his own gallows that he had planned for Mordecai. After that, Esther appears before the king a second time, asks for permission for another edict to go out, this time allowing the Jewish people to defend themselves. And they did that on Adar the 13th and Adar the 14th. And in Susa, they had that extra day, the 14th. Outside of the city, they only did it on the 13th. But they didn't, the Jewish people, when they defended themselves, they did not take any spoils, nothing like that. The scripture is very clear about that. They just defended themselves and God gave them a great victory. So as a result of this, long story, but as a result of this, Mordecai gave a decree that for the Jewish people, this was to be a time of celebration. So from that point on Adar the 14th and Adar the 15th, that they would celebrate the victory that God had given them and preserved the genocide of the Jewish people. So that's a historical background.
That's great, Bruce. I would love to bring you back and do another episode where we can talk more about the way it's celebrated, especially in Israel, if you would do that for us.
Love to.